rescued from the flames, and lost for nearly a century. This book is the only known compilation of insignia of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Assembled by the historical section of the Canadian Army late in the First World War, the Book of Patches is the Rosetta Stone and our key to identifying the authenticity of the most extensive collection of Canadian military uniforms from the Great War. The fiery crucible that forged the most successful fighting force that Canada has ever placed on the field of battle. The spearhead of the British Empire and the genesis of our modern Canadian identity.
The Great War of 1914-18 was a game changer. It not only changed the political map of the world, but changed the military, economic, and social landscape of the world. Ultimately, it changed how we would see ourselves in the British Empire and effectively changed the empire itself.
The repercussions of the Great War and Canada's role in it would be felt for decades to come and would establish many of the institutions now important to the fabric of our country. In this way, the Great War cast the mold for Canadian identity. The effort and sacrifice of these men and women from all walks of life and every part of our country help make the Canada we enjoy today.
Brought together again, they live on in the last reunion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the spearhead of the British Empire.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. And now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
In 1914, Canada was a British nation. Although geographically very large, we had a relatively small population of approximately 7 million people. However, we were part of a larger story and played an important role as the senior sister dominion of the British Empire. So much so that our Governor-General in 1914 was Prince Arthur, the Duke of Connaught, Queen Victoria's favorite son.
When Great Britain declared war on Germany and its allies, Canada enthusiastically heeded the call to defend the empire.
A high percentage of initial recruits for the war were from the British Isles with prior military experience. In fact, the number of British-born volunteers never fell much below 50% of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. As well, almost a third of all Royal Flying Corps pilots had a Canadian connection.
This was a transcontinental nation, so people were widely separated by geography. They were separated in winter. They came from different parts of the world. Most of them, of course, were European. Most of them were Northern European. But the volunteers were, in large measure, British immigrants. And I guess you could say it was a matter of returning home to fight for Britain. The ties between Britain and Canada and British and Canadians were largely much stronger in those days than they became in subsequent years.
Close to 4,000 members of the Canadian Expeditionary Force were also of Aboriginal descent, an astonishing number given the limited civil rights accorded to Canada's First Peoples in the early 20th century.
The census of 1911 seemed to indicate that there were somewhere between 67 million Canadians That did not include Newfoundland and Labrador, of course. And about 650,000 Canadians served in the military. And we have to remember, of course, that these are Canadians, they are males of military age, probably at least 10% of the entire Canadian population that served in the war. That was a very high percentage.
It is hard to imagine the evolution of Canada without the experience of the Great War and the pivotal role played by the Canadian Expeditionary Force.
There are thousands of stories in this collection, stories of men and women who distinguished themselves on the Western Front and through their contribution to Canadian society.
This is Sam Steele, Canada's equivalent to Davy Crockett. Sam Steele was an iconic figure who was larger than life, a central character in over 50 years of Canada's pioneering history. This is Sam Steele's working hat that he wore as a general officer commanding in England during the Great War. Georges Vanier was an officer in the 22nd Battalion, the only French-Canadian battalion on the Western Front. He was awarded the Military Cross for bravery in 1916 and again in 1918 when he was wounded in the chest and in both legs, losing his right leg. Georges Vanier would become the first French-speaking Governor General of Canada in the 1960s. Lieutenant James Hugh Morwick served with the 2nd Motor Machine Gun Brigade. He was awarded the Military Cross for gallantry while advancing under enemy fire. Sadly, only weeks later, he was killed during an air raid on October 10, 1918, at 25 years of age. This is Lieutenant Morwick's early pattern service dress hat. It's the stiff pattern, as we can see, with the very narrow chin strap. This is the officer's badge. It's a very, very nice one, actually quite a rare badge. Inside is Lieutenant J.H. Morwick written here, and there's some biographical material included in there.
Our traditions are twofold: the fundamental freedom and justice for all, and the traditions we helped create as a volunteer soldier in the Great War. They are proud traditions: freedom, justice, service, sacrifice. Respect for discipline justly enforced by properly constituted authority. Unselfish, united effort. The fighting tradition. Not fighting for fighting's sake, but fighting for a cause we believe just. Coupled with our tradition is a faith. It is our faith in human nature, born in those days of stress, when stripped of the artificialities of everyday life. The good and the bad stood out in us for all to see, and we found that even in the worst of us, there was more than a spark of good. C.C. Gillis, 3rd Pioneers, Canadian Expeditionary Force.
Their sacrifice preserved the democracy that we enjoy today.
Moreover, resource-rich Canada contributed gold, mineral wealth, foodstuffs, and munitions to the war effort on a huge scale. But Canada's contribution was more than just through resources of men and supplies. Through our ingenuity and tactics, the Canadian Fighting Force was able to turn the tide of a catastrophic stalemate.
From the very beginning, agricultural supply was very important, and it remained so for the rest of the war. But as the war dragged on, we began to get into other areas of war production. We have to remember that in 1914, this was a country that had basically one factory producing rifles, and they weren't very good. By the end of the war, we're producing millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of munitions, of foodstuffs, of uniforms, even things like wood for crates to hold shells in, artillery shells of all kinds were a very, very important contribution we made to the war. And even aircraft. We began to build aircraft, training aircraft, towards the end of the war. So within that 4-year period, the economy does shift a considerable amount.
Most Canadians know of Vimy Ridge, fought at Easter time 1917, and how the entire Canadian Corps fought together for the first time with a victorious result.
Some historians think it was the greatest thing that Canada has ever done. The Canadian Corps began to perform very well in early 1917, especially at Vimy Ridge. And this was a result of changes that were being made by the commander of the Canadian Corps since late 1916, Byng of Vimy, General Byng. And it was later passed on to Arthur Currie when he took over from Byng in the summer of 1917 as the commander of the Canadian Corps. And by August of 1918, when they're instrumental in the beginning of the last major offensive of the war, which is called the Last 100 Days, they are as good as or better than any other fighting corps on the Western Front.
Vimy is where the myth is born, you know, that Canadian national consciousness. It's the 100 days that validates it. If Vimy, you're becoming a nation because you're doing a great thing on the battlefield, it's the 100 days where you do it again and again and again. And I think that that's really why the 100 days is critically important to that Canadian nation-building myth. It does a lot of things militarily, operationally, politically, strategically, but culturally, it confirms what we suspected first at Vimy. We were different, we were better. And all of a sudden, the 100 days come along and you say, look, not once, not twice, but 6 or 7 times repeatedly, we are the shock army of the British Empire.
For the first time, the Canadian Expeditionary Force had a Canadian commanding officer in the intuitive Sir Arthur Currie, leading our army and planning its battles.
So another reason that the Canadian Corps is unique and almost mythological is because it's the first time that a Prime Minister, a Canadian Prime Minister, has asserted sovereignty within the Empire and within the Commonwealth. So, Prime Minister Borden demonstrates a significant amount of moral courage, and I think is driven to it when he sends a letter and says, look, the Canadian Corps must stay together and we must have a Canadian general. Treat me as an equal ally, and that's my requirement. And to the great credit of not just the British politicians, but also the British generals. They accept that, even though they may have questions about Currie's capacity for war before he's made the Corps commander, questions which he clearly answers. They fulfill that obligation to their ally.
The CEF became very good at what it did, and what it did was to fight set-piece battles. Now, what a set-piece battle is that you don't really plan for a breakthrough. You plan everything that you can possibly plan, knowing that every plan is going to go wrong as soon as the first shot is fired. You build in as much contingency as you can. You plan the artillery strikes against the enemy artillery, counter battery fire. You bring in air power, because at that stage they're using airplanes to strafe and rocket enemy trenches. You bring your tanks in a certain way. You achieve a certain objective, and then you stop, and then you consolidate, and then you move on. That's what we call a set-piece battle. The Canadians became very good at it.
In distinguishing themselves, Canadians became the shock troops of the British Empire.
The esprit de corps that emerged through Currie's leadership during the Great War left an indelible mark on the Canadian Armed Forces of today.
Take a look at the patch that the division wears in the Western Canada today. It's the 3rd Division patch. They claim all the same battle honors. And we can trace our lineage back to through a long line of heroes all the way back to those guys that got on the trains in Alberta and flocked to Lansdowne Park and were the first in the field in 1914. That's what we expect of ourselves now. So it's ever present. If you take a look at the great nation-building events or undertakings, the Great Railway, the Transnational Railway, if you take a look at that, I would argue that tied the country together geographically, physically. But what then tied us together emotionally was the Great War. Not just the Canadian Expeditionary Force, but that kind of shared experience that the Great War forced upon all of us. Whether you're in the trenches, back here on the home front as a daughter or son. I think the Great War resonates for the last century as to be one of the defining national events in the Canadian psyche. And so even recent immigrants will hear of the stories of the Great War, the 100 Days, the Battle of Vimy, and I think it resonates with them because they say, yeah, that is the kind of nation I want to be part of.
The last reunion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the spearhead of the British Empire.
If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep. Though poppies grow in Flanders fields,